Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're going to be talking about the debut album from the band called Ought, titled More Than Any Other Day. But first, a brief history lesson. 2 years ago, in the spring of 2012, the Liberal government of the Canadian province of Quebec aimed to raise university tuition rates from the freeze approximately 75%, from about $2,100 per year to just under $3,800. Now, to the rest of Canada, this particular act was greeted with something of a mixed response. On the one hand, as seeing as a guy who's just 2 years out of university, it really sucks when your tuition is raised by any amount, as it makes it harder for students to afford an education, which was originally the purpose of the tuition freeze in the first place. But on the other hand, Quebec has had the lowest tuition in the country by thousands of dollars for Quebec residents for several years now, and even raising it wouldn't have changed that, and their universities were starting to feel a pinch in maintaining or upgrading their facilities, so breaking the tuition freeze did make a certain amount of sense. Probably could have been done gradually, but I get the principle behind it. But you wouldn't have heard those sort of logical discussions in Quebec because throughout the spring of 2012, thousands of, not tens of thousands of people took to the streets in protest, with several riots breaking out that the provincial government promptly overreacted to, and the whole thing turned into a gigantic, politically ruinous mess. So okay, why bring any of this up? Well, from that tumultuous incident came Ought, a Montreal-based band blending the artsier side of punk music with indie rock that seemed to be directly inspired by that event, along with some inspirations from Richard Hell and especially the Talking Heads. Now, I originally planned on talking about this album a couple months ago when it came out, but I figured now is as good of a time as any to continue to delve into this band and continue my foray into Canadian indie rock. So, what did I find when I looked into their album? Well, honestly, not a huge amount. I'll be honest, I've been sitting on this review for almost 3 months now because I just wasn't sure if I had anything worthwhile to really add to the conversation about an album that is somewhat memorable, but not exactly one I find all that interesting or altogether cohesive, especially given its plethora of very obvious influences and sounds. Now, I'm not saying that it's bad or even that it doesn't execute its intent properly, but that said intent, it just does nothing for me. In other words, More Than Any Other Day by Ought is the sort of record that just might not be for me. So take anything I say here with a certain grain of salt. But okay, why doesn't this band work for me? Ought does draw upon some artisan styles that I do like, especially in the yelping, half-drone, half-spoken word delivery of lead vocalist Tim Beeler that recalls a lot of David Byrne. And while his vocals can occasionally be drowned out a bit by some of the instrumentation more than I'd like, he's got a lot of jittery energy that really does fit the tone of the album. I guess to some extent I still prefer David Byrne's vocals, if only because he sounds like he's in more of his control of his emotions and his material, but Beeler's delivery does work with what he's got here on this album, and honestly, most of the instrumentation here works pretty well too. While the rattling guitars can build to a solid groove, the melody lines, they are distinctive, and they are anchored by a thrumming simmer of the bass, all set against some washed out keyboards and some really grimy violin sections that I did like. And yet, it's never really noisy or distorted, as all the melody lines drive forward and create that snarl through pure interference and intersection, which is kind of interesting in its own right. It doesn't need to rely on that heavy distortion and fuzz. Now, sometimes it can get a little bit messy, like on the opening track Pleasant Heart, or in the closing track Gemini, but the heavy strums of Habit, the upbeat punchiness of the Weather Song, and the really great groove of Around Again, they're memorable enough to draw in a lot of interest against a mix that always feels a little bit too clattering and exposed to really be ignored, but yet somehow comes together and works pretty well. Now, there are reasons why the mix sounds like this, and this comes back to lyrics and themes, which honestly I didn't find nearly as interesting as some critics did. On a loose thematic level, the song is mostly focused on the impending fear of losing control, the dread of being trapped in a system that makes no sense beyond the abstract, that why we should even bother thinking about it, and that will eventually break down in the end the second that people do start thinking about it, with the ultimate message to find some core focus within oneself to be able to withstand that collapse, even if that inner core doesn't really exist or is faulty in its own right. Indeed, the best moments lyrically on this record are when that internal stability is questioned and compromised, like the Velvet Underground-inspired song Habit, or the sarcastic commentary on a cyclical life and Around Again. And when it's focused on these internal crises, all of which can be seen as a fairly easy metaphors for the political instability of the time, the album holds together pretty well. And yet, the ending songs, Clarity and Gemini, seem to be the sort of angry punk jibes against establishment figures and a recommitment to finding that inner purpose. Well, okay, that's fine in its own right, but they're a little bit less inspired, and they're lacking a little bit in subtlety, and they're nothing I couldn't have otherwise heard on, say, the Rise Against album I reviewed a couple weeks ago. But then again, you can make that argument for the entire album, especially considering the instrumentation or lyrics never really accentuates any moments of rawness or real explosive power to drive these points home. Now, okay, look, punk music can work when it sticks to some of this more basic subject matter and then supplements it with raw energy and passion and tightness, which this band occasionally has. But here's where my biggest problem comes with this album, because More Than Any Other Day by Ought drags a lot. Every track on this 8-song record is longer than 4.5 minutes, with the average length being close to 5 minutes 45 seconds, and it frequently feels like the mantras that Ought is trying to create and drive forward are more than a little bit drawn out. Now, on the one hand, I get why they're doing it. For like an act like Swans, for instance, they're trying to use a slow crescendo to intensify that tension and dread. But on the other hand, Swans at least knew how to pay off that crescendo with moments of crushing, noisy intensity. And Michael Gira always had a very firm grip on the implacable power of his music. He had everything under very tight control. Ought, on the other hand, they seem to be stepping in the opposite direction lyrically and instrumentally, and yet I never get the feeling that the encroaching chaos ever pays off in any real moments of presence and power, which leaves the record feeling a little bit flaccid and anticlimactic lyrically and instrumentally, which does bother me somewhat. But you know what? In the end, I mostly like More Than Any Other Day by Ought. It's by no means perfect or a must-buy even now, but if you've got the patience for an artier punk record and that takes its time and does produce some pretty solid grooves and a couple interesting lyrical ideas that are done well, it's worth a couple listens, I guess. As I said before, I found the record leaden and not particularly gripping lyrically, but I'll admit that others might find it stronger, and some of the guitar melodies, they're definitely worthy of some praise. So with that, and the fact that I never really found it uninteresting and there were no real dud songs on the record, I think a very cautious 7 out of 10 is appropriate, and a very cautious recommendation along with it. So if you missed Ought's debut record a few months ago, give it a listen. You might enjoy it. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. If there's any other albums that came out this year or are coming out this year that you want me to take a look at, or any other thing I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm more than happy to hear it. But until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.